Good afternoon. Welcome to Running Your Hybrid Apartment. We'll be starting up in about 1 minute. If you want to download Running Your Hybrid Apartment Workshop Manual, you can do so at the website on the screen. And right now, for those who are thinking about it, Facebook Live isn't going to work, but we will definitely be posting the webinar on our website and our YouTube channel after. So we'll see you on the other side in about 1 minute. We'll start up. Thank you. So good afternoon, and welcome to Running Your Hybrid Apartment, a webinar that we're running today for you. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here at the Cornell Local Roads program, and hoping you're having a great day and a nice, sunny, cool day here in the middle of May. A couple of items just to feedback before we get started. If you move your mouse down to the bottom of the screen, you'll come across some settings on the bottom. You can control your audio, your sound. The chat pod has been disabled, but you may see a location put in that. So if you wanted to see the location for the box folder where the workshop manual is, it would be there. I may be asking you to raise your hands now and then to answer a question or two. And if you do have a question, please put them in the chat pod, the question and answer pod that's over on the right. And we'll be following up with those and getting back to you as quickly as possible. So just ask them as we go along. This session is going to be worth 1 professional development hour for engineers here in New York State. Only the person who's registered can earn that particular PDH. If you are here for most of the workshop, more than 3/4, you will get a certificate of attendance. And in that case, we could help you out if you've got multiple people at your site. And this will be considered a course. To get the PDH here in New York State, you need to send us a certificate of attendance, which you will get a couple of days after the webinar. If you're from another state and you need a PDH, you're going to have to check with your LTAP center, see what the rules are for the particular rules in the state. So let's get started with our Running Your Hybrid Apartment webinar. Now, we're going to be using a workbook that we generated for our class. Obviously, normally we would be holding the class, Running Your Hybrid Apartment, Management, Administration, and Operations. You can download this. You could search for it on our website, or you could get the direct link that's there. We're going to use that as our guide today. Obviously, we can't cover everything in a 6-hour class, so we're going to cover the highlights, and hopefully you'll pick up something that you can use to help you with your running of your hybrid apartment or running with your crew or anything you do on a day-to-day basis. Now, there are 9 sections within the workshop manual. Obviously, we're not going to be able to go into depth on a lot of them, but we can cover some of the highlights for you. And to start with, we're going to do introductions. And we'll start with, I'll come over here, and I'm going to launch up the poll. We actually only have 1 poll today, and that helps me figure out how many of you are here, who do you work for, and how long have you been with your agency. Remember, if you're answering the question, scroll down so we can see all 3 questions before you hit submit, okay? And so I'd just like to get a sense of how many folks are in the room, how long have you been with your agency, and then we'll try to get at least 3/4 of you to vote. We're getting there. Got a few more. Okay. So we're in the polling. Share the results. So like we've seen in the past, most of you are by yourself, as would be expected, though a few of you have large groups watching. Most of you work for local government. There's a few with the state, and there's a couple of honest people here who work for the weekend. But as I've said before, I'm not sure what day it is sometimes. In terms of how long you've been with your organization, quite a variety today. While most of you have, almost half, have greater than 10 years. There's almost even split among the brand new, the 1 to 4, and the 5 to 10. So that actually helps me quite a bit. So thank you very much, and get that poll out of the way, and we'll keep moving. Now, as we talk about highway departments here in New York State specifically, really want to also talk about who owns the highways, because that's obviously one of the largest agencies within local government, and towns own over half the centerline mileage here in New York State. In fact, if you look at the municipally owned roads, the state actually only has about 13% of the overall mileage. Most of the roads are owned by local agencies. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters because of budgets. And obviously right now, budgets are a big issue for a lot of us that we're going to have to deal with. So it's something we just have to keep in mind. And as we move forward, we go from there, okay? So in terms of the highway cost per mile, well, I'm going to show you some data that we've collected over the years. We've gone through and calculated it out. And this is the ranges for various types of governments here in New York State. So towns are about $14,000, sort of in the middle of the range, with $10,000 to $20,000 per mile being the most common. Counties at about $35,000, again, because they've got usually a little thicker roads, a little wider roads, a little more traffic. Villages, you're going to deal with storm sewers, things like that. And cities, not counting New York City, about $37,000. But again, there's a range. Now, to show you how this works, somebody who knows both your total budget, if you're with a town, that would be your DA and DB accounts. With a county, it'd be your D and DM accounts. With your village or city, you need to know the street portion of your budget. If somebody knows that number, they could put it over in the question and answer pod, but you also need to know your total budget or your total centerline mileage. I'd like your centerline mileage in the question and answer pod if we could get it. See if somebody can put in the number in the question and answer pod. I'm going to try a little magic trick. Okay, so we have a number in there. Okay, so what I'm going to do, and Gary, you're a pretty rural town if I remember correctly. So let me put this number in. And so you have about $500,000 in your D and A and DB accounts. Am I close? And let's see if Gary says, did we do well or not? Yes. Okay. Now, that's what's cool about this. Okay. So we'll try one more. Okay, John, I don't know off the top of your head what level of government you're dealing with and whether you're rural or urban. Okay, so that's pretty rural as well, but not quite as rural. So you've got about $750,000 in your accounts combined. How'd we do? Okay. This doesn't tell you what you need, okay? This is a way for you to see how you compare to your compatriots. If you're really rural, you might be on the low end of the range. If you're really urban, you might be on the upper end or even above it. But it allows you to compare to see how you compare to others, okay? The reality, though, is how much you need is a different calculation, and we can do that, okay? So, for instance, I'll do one last one. Somebody put in 407 centerline miles in Syracuse, so pretty urban, okay? Now, if that's a town, that's probably going to be in the range of, do the math. So in that case, you're going to be $6 or $7 million for your DA and DB accounts. If you're if you're a village or a city, you would even be about 2 or 3 times that. Okay. Again, it's just a comparison. It allows you to see how you're comparing to your neighbors. It doesn't say what you exactly need, but it's nice for you to know whether or not you're above or below what the other folks are doing within the state. And you can see there's quite a bit of a range. Downstate, there are some towns that are over $70,000 to $100,000 per centerline mile annually. Sounds like a lot until you realize they've got a lot of things to deal with. They've got a lot of traffic. They probably got a lot of other issues that they're going to have to deal with, and the expected level of service might be different. So again, there's a lot of factors involved. But when you're managing your department, it's nice to know how much money should you have in the budget. But in this case, it's at least how much you've got compared to your neighbors. Now, why is this important right now? Well, right now, it's also important because where do we get our funding? These numbers I've got on the screen are from 2014. I've got numbers from 2017. They haven't changed much. If you look at town financing, about 2% of town roads financing comes from the federal government, usually fairly big projects or specialty projects like safe routes to schools. CHIPS statewide is about 10% of highway department funds, statewide, CHIPS, okay, and some other funds that the state provides. Most of the money to pay for town highways, and this is also true for cities, villages, and counties, is from local dollars, which means property taxes and sales taxes. And obviously we know sales taxes are being affected. So this is going to be an issue as we start talking about budgets. So I just want you to keep that in mind. Now, if you look at those same budgets, by the way, cost per person, because there's more people downstate, even though they cost more per center line miles, their cost per person actually goes down a little bit or comes towards the middle. So it turns out highways are cheap. They're a bargain. The cost per day for most highways in New York State is less than $1 per person. That's a pretty good bargain for the kind of services that we all provide. But just to keep that in mind, but I know there's pressure on everybody because when you look at the percentage of the total budget, whether it's a town, village, county, or city, highway departments most of the time are pretty large percentages, and in the places where they aren't, usually it's because they're in an urban area and they have other infrastructure activities such as water and sewer, parks and rec, okay? So let's talk about that a little bit. Now, obviously there's the most common responsibilities we all have, signs and snow and ice and roads and all kinds of other activities. What I'd like you to do for me, let me see if my little tool works here. Over in the Q&A pod, if you could put down for me some responsibilities, the kinds of things that you do beyond the typical, things that you do beyond roads, beyond bridges, beyond snow plowing. What else do you do for your agency? Let's see what kind of answers we get here. What other things do people do? I know there's things you do beyond highway work. Most agencies do. Parks, that's a good one. Yep, parks and cemetery. Okay. Yep, sanitary sewers. You've got a transit system. Okay. We've got trash and garbage pickup. Yep. Let's see what other ones we got in here. Water systems, a separate stormwater system that's outside. Water itself, water department. Okay. So again, there's all these other responsibilities, and you start thinking about that on top of everything else that you've got to deal with. It can be a bit of a challenge, okay? So let's go back and see how I did. I made up a slide of the other kind of activities that we might do. I missed one, I'll admit it. When I put the slide together, I forgot about the fact that some of us do transit stuff, so that's my fault. But I got everything else. I got recycling, we got parks, we got cemeteries, we got separate stormwater systems, and are dealing with drainage that's not a highway related drainage, garbage pickup. Some agencies actually have electric. I lived in Pinyan. Pinyan has its own electric department. Water, sewer, picking up leaves. It's not really a highway function. And then of course, how many of us mow the lawn at the town hall or actually wind up doing building maintenance, okay? These are all items that actually don't belong in the highway budget, but obviously a lot of times they get commingled pretty easily. So again, as we're thinking, we have to include that in our calculations. And then the other thing I don't want to forget about is change. Change is inevitable, improvement isn't, is what Len Irwin always liked to say. And so as a reminder, these are some pictures from last Saturday up in Denmark. Oh, no. This is a video from 1939. and just notice how things have changed, okay? Uh, those trucks that you see coming down and hitting the big snowbanks, no seatbelts, no air seats, things have changed. Some things have gotten better, but change is inevitable. We need to be ready for change, and obviously, we're dealing with change right now, okay? So keep that in mind as we go through running the highway department, okay? And by the way, imagine driving this truck with no seatbelt. Okay, so I want to start and spend a little bit of time on department organization. Okay, now every organization should have a purpose, it should have a goal, and then those goals are done by task. Okay, do any of you have a purpose for your department that you've actually shared? It could be a catchphrase, it could be a longer 1 or 2 sentence thing. Here at the Local Roads Program, our goal is to help you improve the quality of the safety of your highways through our technology transfer and our training. But does any of you have such a thing that you've shared with the public or with your board? Let's see if anybody has any answers to that. Okay, while I'm waiting for that, it's something you should think about. Even if it's not something you're going to share, what is the purpose of the highway department or the public works department? What is it you're trying to do? Okay, who do you serve? What is your goal? Okay, now goals are things that we can measure. Goals are activities that we can say, okay, we're going to have all of the roads plowed in a reasonable time frame. Okay, now you could define what that time frame is, or you could say different types of roads have different time frames, but you're going to write down a series of goals for your department. Okay, for a particular year, you might be having a goal of doing a certain amount of paving or the certain quality of the roads that you'd like to see at the end of the day. And to get all of these goals done, you're going to have tasks, okay? And we keep a long list of tasks ourselves. So those tasks should go back to your overall goals. So if the goal is to have every road paved in a good condition, well, that means you may need to pave a certain amount each year. So that becomes a task. We're going to pave a certain amount each year. And let's see what we have over in the Q&A pod. I do the most I can with what I have to work with. Yeah, it's an old phrase. Do what you can with what you have where you are. Okay? But the best goals are ones that can be measured. Okay? I understand we all have to live within the limitations that we've got. But if you can't measure it, how do you know whether you're meeting your goal or not? Okay? So if you can, try to write down goals that you can actually measure. Okay? So if your budget for chips is $200,000, how do you spend that money in the most efficient way possible? We'll talk about that here in just a second, okay? Now, in terms of your organizational structure, what kind of structure do you have within your organization? If you're a small department, 5, 6 people, which is really, really common. Oh, we got a good goal here. Before I go, I'm going to go back here because I like this. He has a goal to eliminate all dirt roads. That's actually a pretty good goal when you think about it, to eliminate all dirt roads. Obviously, you've then got to create a series of tasks to do that. Okay, you can't just pave over the gravel, because if you pave over the gravel, next year after spring thaw, you'll have another gravel road again. So you're going to have to set a series of tasks. How quickly can you get that done? Okay, it's measurable, especially if you put a time behind it. Okay, so that's actually a pretty good idea of a goal. Okay. Now, in terms of your organizational structure, it could be pretty simple. If you're a small department, that's going to be a pretty simple operation. You know, if you're small, you're just going to have the highway official, okay, at the top. And then you might just literally have 4 boxes if you got a crew of 4, and there's no one person who's above somebody else. And that would be your departmental structure, okay? But obviously, the more complicated you get, the more challenging that's going to become, okay? And you might want to have somebody who is your deputy, okay? Because what happens if you're out? What happens if you get sick with COVID-19? So that person is a deputy. They might be a crew leader. They may not be. And those people, do they report directly to the deputy, even with a small department? Or they actually sort of parallel over here on the side, reporting to the highway superintendent until the day the superintendent is out. Okay? So these are things you need to think about as you're looking at your organizational structure. The thing I like to do when it comes to looking at the organizational structure is it's relatively easy when it's small. But ask yourself, if the highway superintendent wants to take a day off and go on vacation, what's going to be the structure? How do you make sure things get done? How do you communicate that information back and forth? So you should have a structure in place that makes sense, that everybody understands who's responsible when different people are in or out. Okay, and in the light of COVID-19, that's probably more important than ever that we have things like that. And then how do you manage that department? Management styles makes a huge difference, and there are lots of management styles that exist out there. My favorite one, actually, in a lot of ways, is something called management by walking around. Being stuck at home, and everybody on the local roads program scattered in, we actually live in 7 different jurisdictions. It makes it challenging, okay, for 7 people living in 7 different municipal jurisdictions to do management by walking around. So I have to look at alternatives, okay? So maybe we do participative management. We do Zoom meetings. Maybe you do management by objectives, where going back to those goals and objectives and tasks, you write down your task and make sure everybody is on the same page, and then you just have to assign people work and say, go fill potholes. Now, if you're using that particular technique, management by objectives, you need to make sure everybody's on the same page with that objective. Because if you tell people go out and fill potholes, and what you meant was to fill the potholes with hot mix, and they went out and grabbed the cold mix truck, and afterwards you don't have the quality you wanted, you really haven't gotten your objective. So make sure everybody's on the same page, okay? And it may change. With new staff, you're probably going to have to use more of a directional style, where you're going to have to almost give them verbatim what you need to get done. But eventually you'll get people on board. Remember, they have that brain. Take advantage of it. And you can just start giving them general goals and general direction, okay? There's something called the comprehensive method, which is a really good way to manage your system. And that is, it varies depending not only on the work, who's involved, but it can even change as you're going through a day, as you're dealing with different issues. And it's a good way to manage crisis by taking advantage of all the different management styles. Okay, so we have here in the Q&A box, I take a day off, I tell the department, and you leave somebody a list to choose from for different weather conditions. That's a really good idea. It's a way to keep things moving even if you take a day off. You're giving people this management by objectives kind of technique where they can select, okay, this is good for clear weather, this is good for a rainy day. Obviously, if it's snowing, we're all going to go out and take care of the snow conditions. So think about what management style works best for you. And at the end of the day, pick one that's going to get the most bang for the buck, if you possibly can. Now, I hope everybody has a personnel policy, and we're going to see if everybody remembers. I told you I might make you interactive. Scroll down to the bottom. You should be able to raise your hand. Okay, so you can raise your hand. Do you have a approved personnel policy, not one that's informal, but an actual written personnel policy? And while that's happening, somebody here says it uses simple dry erase board with the tasks that need to be done. And if not, the deputy fills in. Good. A good way to take those goals and tasks, put them in writing so everybody sees what needs to get done. Okay? So only about 1/6 of you, well, we're getting a little bit more now, about a quarter of you have raised your hand that you have a personnel policy. Okay? You should have a personnel policy. Now, do you need to put everything in writing? No. We'll talk about that at the end of this hour. That's actually can actually be counterproductive to put too much into personnel policy. But what kind of things should be in a good personnel policy? What do you think we should include? Okay. Let's see what people have for ideas for what should be in a good personnel policy. Leave and sick time, time off. Yeah, that's probably the first one most people have. So everybody's on the same page. Okay, so your leave and your sick time, your hours of work, maybe your dress code if you've got one. When do you have to wear PPE or other activities like that? Okay. Now, we could spend, and when we do the full day class, we could actually spend 20, 30 minutes discussing what's in a personnel policy. We've posted a couple of them on our website, including one of our Q&A people put in hours, days we work, and time off. Mr. Griswold actually shared his from Preble, and it's got a lot more in it because there's things you want to have in there like hours and time off, but there's things you have to actually have by rule. Things on Family and Medical Leave Act, sexual harassment, workplace violence. Those are things you have to have, alcohol and drugs, precisely, okay? Think about things you have to have, but also think about ones you want to have so everybody's on the same page. And remember, we are not sheep. We are different humans. We all think differently. So you want to have flexible policies if at all possible, okay? Now, in terms of working this out, making it all work, we got to work with others, okay? There's two different types of scenarios I want to make sure we understand. One is working with other departments. You should have shared service agreements to protect each other from liability and things like that, but you also should make sure everybody's balanced, okay? Now, the comptroller would tell me I have to be balanced precisely at the end of every single year. Do me a favor. You still want to write it down. Keep a log. If town A lets village B borrow 3 trucks for the day, that means they've got 3 truck days they're owed, okay? Now, if the village comes back with a specialty piece of equipment, maybe a sewer cleaner, that's really expensive, maybe you don't need 3 days of the sewer cleaner, but you get back a day and a half. Okay, that's a 2-for-1 deal, but it's actually worthwhile. Write these things down and make sure that you're close at the end of the year, that you're balanced, that it's a partnership, that we're working with other departments. And if you've got a good log, you'll actually catch and see those guys who are always borrowing but never actually donating, okay? We want to work together, okay? And then the other one I want to make sure we're on the same page on is the private versus the public sector. I hear all the time people go, oh, the public sector can do things so much better than, the private sector can do so much better than the public sector. I'm a firm believer, instead of making an assumption, why don't you write some things down? And it's a technique that I like to use. What I'll do is I'll take a particular project and I'll write down just essentially a couple of columns for that particular project, whether I'm going to do it in-house with my own crew or a contractor. And of course, truth be told, I could actually have a third column over here, which I'll call the hybrid, okay? Where in that particular case, maybe I'm having the contractor do some parts and I'm doing other parts with the crew. And start writing down the strengths and the weaknesses, okay? So you can imagine that. So give me a project where you've thought about whether you want to do it in-house versus a contractor. And I'll quickly see what I can do to sketch up my strengths and weaknesses in about 3 minutes. See if somebody comes up with an example for me, hopefully not too far afield. They're gonna let me off the hook. I can use the one out of my book. I might be able to use the one out of the book if they don't give me one here in a minute. Oh, somebody got one. Culvert repair. Oh, a culvert repair. That's not too bad. Okay. Overly large culverts. Okay, that's a good one. We'll do culverts. Okay. So if you think about that, and we're just going to assume completely in-house versus a contractor, though a hybrid option actually is really effective a lot of times with culverts, where the big stuff is done by the contractor. But the advantage of doing it in-house, well, obviously you have the ability to control schedule. You can do it on your own schedule. That's always cool. Okay, so I like that. Okay. The ability to, keep your crew involved. That's actually, I think that's a strength. And you might have a crew that's really good to do things like that. Okay. Now, some of the weaknesses, you always want to think about the weaknesses of something like that. There's a risk if something goes wrong, because now if there's a failure, it's all on the town. And if it's a complicated activity, it could be a risk. If it's something like one of the people put in a multi-plate pipe, well, let me ask you, do you need to train your people to make sure they do it properly? Okay. Do they properly know how to tighten the bolts? Do they properly know what to do in terms of backfill and things like that? And of course, while they're doing that, there's an opportunity cost. The crew is not available anymore. My pen is not being happy with me. There we go. So that's something to think about. On the other side, with a contractor, well, they've already been trained. At least you should be hiring good trained contractors, so that's good. And they should be able to do the work pretty quick, and they can get all the specialty equipment and all that. So, and you can even get the cost ahead of time. That's actually a strength. On the other side, you're going to have to schedule it in advance. Okay? So now the schedule is a little bit less controlled. Okay? And you're going to probably have to provide some inspection, which is an additional cost. Okay? So that's just a quick, me throwing together some ideas real fast. Obviously, cost is part of this, but the whole idea is you write down the strengths, you write down the weaknesses, and then you can start figuring out what really is the best option for your particular municipality. You can do that for every job to decide whether you're going to go with your own crews or go out. And that can save you quite a bit of time. So keep that in mind when you're working with whether it's private sector versus public or even a hybrid, okay? Now, how do you know whether you're doing it well, measuring achievement? Well, a lot of people talk about effectiveness. Well, I want to talk about two things, effectiveness and efficiency. They're not the same, but people get them mixed up all the time. What am I looking at on this picture? Can somebody tell me what am I looking at in the photograph on the screen? What am I looking at in the photograph on the screen here? An efficient use of land? Possibly. Yeah. Okay. Looks like a farm field, right? Okay. It's supposed to look like a farm field. It's not. This is actually a parking lot. I know it doesn't look like a parking lot from above. That's the whole idea. Okay. It's a parking lot from underneath. This is a Boeing plant out in Washington during World War II. And they covered it with large netting and plants so it looked like a farm field or just an open field because they didn't want it bombed. So they had to cover it over. Not very efficient, but very, very effective. And to keep that in mind when you're thinking later on. Effective means you're getting the job done. It may not be efficient sometimes, but sometimes we just have to get the job done. Efficiency means we're actually doing it in such a way we're getting the best bang for the buck. And that's pretty important. How do we measure that? Well, yeah, it does look like a field, doesn't it? Yeah. Actually, the measures of efficiency, the most common is something called the benefit cost ratio. You'll see that all the time. The benefit cost ratio is pretty simple. You take the benefits, if my pen will work. Ooh, I don't like that color though. Let me get a different color here. I'll go with white today. You take the benefits, you divide it by the cost, and you hope that's greater than 1. It's pretty simple. There's something here called the return on investment. That sounds really complicated. The return on investment. Well, the return on investment is actually not as complicated as it sounds. All the return on investment is they take the benefits, they subtract the cost, and then they divide by the cost. And you want that number to be greater than 0. Okay? They're the same thing. Just pick one that you like. I like benefit cost because it's nice and simple. The challenge for all of us in the municipal sector, however, how do you define the benefit? It's pretty easy to define the benefit if you're bringing in money, you're making a profit, or you're looking at things that you can measure easily. But how do you define the benefit of a nice park? How do you define the benefit of saving an old covered bridge to the community? Okay? So that's a challenge for us in the government sector, but it's a way we can measure the efficiency. You can at least do that for things like, am I getting as much ditching as I want? One of the higher benefit cost ratio is more efficient, okay? Another technique you can use is called the total cost. And you can actually put this into your bids where you actually measure the total cost of say a truck over its lifespan, including the cost of the gas, the maintenance, and all that. You can actually put that into your bid specifications. It's pretty cool. Now, in terms of keeping score, I wish we had more time. We could really go through and have a lot of fun with that. There's lots of different ways to keep score, but for the sake of argument, just remind yourself, keep score. Write down how much work you get done and see how you're doing. It's worth doing. And it does actually go back to those goals that we had later on that we're measuring against. And of course, at the end of the day, please do it right. Quality is great and should be number one. Quantity sounds good until you realize if you're doing it wrong and you have to go back and fix it again, maybe quantity wasn't our first goal after all, okay? I think the one in the upper right, by the way, is where Shaquille O'Neal's kids go, Shaquille, but I'm not sure about that. And what are your priorities? Well, obviously the number one priority should be safety, okay? That's our number one priority. Everything else we can negotiate, and it's a challenge we deal with when we have to balance different types of safety for different people, including our own people, okay? Now, in terms of developing action plans, in the full day class, we'd spend a whole bunch of time on plans, and of course, here are the most common plans. Everybody wants to get something done, so there's a lot of zeal, but then of course, things get in the way, so there's delay. Then everybody begins to panic because we're running out of time, so we're going to blame somebody, punish the people who really weren't involved, and then once it does get done, we praise everybody, especially the people who didn't cause a problem, so that means usually praising the people who weren't involved. Okay, I'm being a little bit sarcastic, but that does seem to be happening sometimes to us. Really, we got to plan. Planning is the single most important step, even though once we mobilize, things are going to change. We go get the work done, and we clean up the site. Most people think we're done here. The reality is you need to go back and evaluate. Look at what you've done and decide if I'm going to do it again. And you may have years between that, but keep evaluating, keep looking. We can always get better. Now, what are your duties and responsibilities? Well, again, we could spend a whole bunch of time on that, but we don't have it. But I'd have some good news for you. If there's legal issues you're worried about, tomorrow in the morning at 10 o'clock, we're doing a legal panel. Hey, I didn't put that on there, so I'll put that on here, 10 a.m. Okay, and we actually have the same legal people we usually have at the highway school from the Association of Towns, the Comptroller, and NICOM answering your questions. So submit them to clrp@cornell.edu, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can tomorrow. But I do want to go through a few of the duties and responsibilities that you should be thinking about. Obviously, one of your first ones is payroll and vouchers. Okay, you need to certify people did the work that they were supposed to do. They were there when they were supposed to get paid, or in this case, if they might be working from home, making sure they're actually on call, and then fill out any vouchers. Okay. Highway right-of-way. I got a slide on that. I'll come back to that one a little bit. Okay. And by the way, I know some of you are going to have right-of-way questions, so please send them in. And remember, you do have to register just like you do for the webinars. You just need to register for the legal panel tomorrow. You need to put people on a notice. You'll hear about that notice. Written notice versus constructive notice. That essentially means that the municipality has been put on notice that there's a defect. There's two types. Written notice means somebody puts it in writing to the municipality that there's a defect. That one varies in terms of the law and what people have to do. A call from the cops, for instance, in the police department, that's a form of written notice. But there's another type of notice we forget about. It's called constructive notice. If you actually built something incorrectly or you should have known about it, you're still on notice. If there's a pothole sitting outside the driveway to the highway garage and it's been there for 3 months, you can't claim I didn't know about it because somebody didn't tell me in writing. It's pretty clear you should have known about it because you were there every single day. So be careful. If you know of the defect, don't just ignore it. In terms of records that you've got to have, there's lots of records. I got a simple rule of thumb for you. Just remember this. Everything you've got, and you need to check with your legal people and the records management people, but everything you've got, you need to keep it 7 years past the end of its tenure, its time. So if it's an employee, at least 7 years after they retire, and maybe longer in some cases. If it's a road or a bridge, guess what? The roads or bridges are not going anywhere, so you pretty much have to keep those forever, okay? So it's a good rule of thumb. It's not perfect, and I would check with your people, but it's a good rule to get you started, about 7 years minimum. And restricting and closing roads, that's one of the primary duties of all highway officials. Make sure you know how to do that. Keep the forms available at all times, okay? Because you're trying to reduce liability and risk. We do have a whole day of class on liability and risk, and you could download that manual as well. And then, of course, your annual reports. What kind of annual reports do you have? Obviously, the reports you need for chips, your inventories, things like that, your budgets. Just do me a favor. If you're not sure about annual reports, make a list. It's easy enough to do, and you shouldn't miss anything then. Now, I told you I had a slide for right-of-way. The right-of-way rules are pretty simple, okay? In this particular case, if this is a road by use, the right-of-way is the blacktop. If you have a deed, you follow the deed, okay? So on this particular road, where do you think the right-of-way goes? In the chat pod, where do you think the right-of-way is? Nobody wants to hazard a guess. Up, here we go, behind the ditches, possibly, to the stone wall. We hear that a lot, to the stone wall. Here's the rule. You have to have a deed and used and maintained for 10 or more years. And the used is by the public. So it's not just a single driveway. So this road obviously has been used by the public. That's pretty easy. But where you maintain is important. A tree that's big enough to be a fixed object is not going to define the right-of-way, okay? So the stone wall, most people would think the stone wall is going to be the right-of-way, but if there's a tree in front of it, like that one right there, or this one right here, that would kill you if you hit it or hurt you severely, your right-of-way is probably actually at best in front of the tree, okay? You certainly will probably get to the ditch, but you may not get to that stone wall, okay? And yes, right-of-ways can change, and you can lose the right-of-way in only 6 years, okay? So keep that in mind. It's 10 years to gain it, but only 6 years to lose it. And once that tree's there, you may have lost it. And again, I know some of you are going to have additional right-of-way questions. Put them in for the legal panel. Do not use the 284, the tax maps, by the way. Tax maps are not deeds. Tax maps are there for tax purposes only. They can help you find the deeds, but you need to see the actual deed at the county clerk's office. Now, if you're with a town, you have to have a 284 agreement. That 284 agreement is changeable, and obviously right now should be changed, but that's not a unilateral thing. That needs to be done. It's an agreement between the highway official, okay, and the board. Majority of the board and the highway superintendent. It's not a unilateral document. And I know for counties and villages and cities, you don't have a 284 agreement equivalent, but it's actually not a bad idea to make sure everybody's on the same page before you try to get any work done. Now, hopefully you've got a good library of information. One of the things that's funny, we talk about in the workbook, having a paper library so you know where to find things when the power goes out. Right now, it's the opposite. We need to have an electronic library because we can't get to our paper library. Though last week I was able to do a Mission Impossible mission and grab a couple of things out of our library area. I felt a little like Tom Cruise finding the secret nuclear bunker. Now, in terms of your fleet equipment management, we could spend a lot of time talking about this, but I want you to think about this. Do you know what you've got in your fleet? Do you have a good inventory of both the large equipment and the small equipment? That's pretty important to have a good fleet inventory. And when do you replace your equipment? Okay, you should replace the equipment when it costs more to maintain than it's really worth. Okay, obviously the backhoe here is probably beyond its life because we've done so much damage to it. Now, in terms of how much money do you need to have in your budget to replace your equipment, I hate to say this, way too often when I've talked to people around the state, their amount of money they have for their cyclic replacement, their capital equipment plan, what number do you think I'm going to write down here? What do you think they have in their budget for replacing equipment? See if somebody can come up with the number. It's the most common, yep, 0. By far, the most common number I saw for an equipment replacement plan was 0. But I'm going to show you how to calculate that out. So if somebody typing in the Q&A pod could tell me, how much does a brand new truck cost? Brand new truck. Nice, good 10-wheel, 6-wheel. Okay, here we go. Nice one. Okay, so we have $268,000. Everybody's always amazed by that when you talk outside the highway community. Okay, and how long are you going to keep that truck? 15 years, okay? So we're going to keep it for 15 years, okay? That's our goal. Well, all I've got to do, if I know the cost of the new piece at 268 and another life at 15 years, okay? And I go grab my little calculator over here and I type that in, okay? And I divide that out. I need 17,800 and change, okay? And I can actually round that up. I'll just call that $17,900 every year, okay? That's every single year. And if I got a fleet of 10 trucks, that means I need at least 10 times that amount in my equipment fund just to pay for those trucks, okay? So you could do that for all your piece of equipment and see how much money you really need to have. Most of us don't have enough, I know that, okay? Now, there's probably somebody going, Dave, there's inflation factors we have to deal with. Okay, there's the formula. If you'd like to download, it's in there. We have a spreadsheet on our website. You can actually plug the inflation factor in it. It'll calculate it out. It does make a small difference, but truth be told, run the simple calculation first. It'll get you in the ballpark, and at least you'll get a chance to see, are you close to where you need to be and not at zero? When you're thinking about your equipment, remember in municipal sector, we own pieces of equipment that others don't have to own because we have to deal with odd things. So the young lady, she didn't set up right, but we've got to deal with snow and ice and wind and rain, floods, emergencies. We have to have our equipment working. So we may want to keep it in better condition than you might think. Don't stretch it too long because if it breaks down at the wrong time, what are you going to do? Okay. Now, in terms of budget development, we got 14 minutes. We're not going to be able to develop a budget. That's the bad news. I got good news, however. On May 28th, we're going to be doing a webinar on budget basics, okay? And we may be doing additional ones dealing with COVID issues as we go through the summer. We're looking at that right now. But I do want you to remember with the budget, there's only a few things you got to really keep in mind. You're going to see things called account codes and ledger code and object codes. Just remember the accounts. Do me a favor. There's the A accounts and everything else. And for highways, it's the DAs and the Ds and the DMs. You might have a capital project, which is an H. The way the budgets work, these accounts, you can't take the money from here back to air. That's not allowed, okay? Once the budgets have been set up, the money has to stay in those areas. Now, if there is no money available because there's just no money coming in, if there's no money coming in, that's one thing. But they can't transfer out of the DA, DB, DDM into your A funds. They cannot do that. And if they're doing that, well, then you need to start talking to somebody because that's not what they're supposed to be doing, okay? But again, we have a webinar on that. Again, please register for that. That'll be in 9 days. Now, managing the infrastructure, we've already seen this idea of scheduling work. It's going to come down to it. The best people who know how to do this have good asset management plans. And asset management means the right treatment in the right place at the right time, okay? Now, the right treatment, we can do better than this, okay? That's not the right treatment, okay? I'd rather do nothing. The right place, we're usually pretty good at that. The right place is usually pretty good. I got a pothole, I'm going to fill the pothole. It's the right time that gets us in trouble, even after we've chosen the right repair. What's wrong with this particular paving photograph? Anybody know? Why am I going to have an issue with this particular paving operation? Nobody's going to answer that one? They don't want to take a guess? No leaves, too cold, late in the year. Very good. Yes, Good job. Nice. It's the wrong season. This was actually in late October. Now, in this particular case, they still needed to pave it. They were replacing a culvert pipe that had had problems, so they needed to replace it. In fact, remember Lynn Irwin, his house is just behind the truck there, up on the top of the hill there. I was out looking at him, and we went down there and looked. They had to pave it. They couldn't leave it unpaved for the winter. So there is a difference sometimes between the optimum time, okay, and the right time. In this case, it probably was okay, but it wasn't optimum. Okay, so keep that in mind. That's why we want to have asset management or pavement management. And again, we have a webinar coming up on that. Okay, that'll actually be, if I did my math right, I think that's next week. Yeah, next week on preparing an asset management plan for your pavements. So register and join us for that. And the great news is once you learn how to do asset management for your pavements, Thursday. It's this Thursday. Oh, I tell you, I can't keep the day straight. Next Thursday. It's a week from Thursday. So please register in advance, though. It allows you to prioritize and plan everything in your system. How do you choose between two bad choices? Okay. So, you know, don't want to do that. The nice thing is once you learn to do this, you can use it on everything. Asset management works for everything we've got. Now, before we move on, I see a question here. If the ground is above 40, I thought you could pave. Well, you can get away with it, but your chances of failure start to go up. You actually want that ground temperature 50, but more importantly, what's the temperature at night? Because what happens is for pavement, as it cools, that could be a problem. I got some good news for you. Next Tuesday, I got that one right, I think. Next Tuesday, we're doing a session on pavement maintenance. We'll talk a little bit about some of those kinds of activities. Again, please register. Okay, now as a manager, you're going to need to do plans and specifications, all kinds of things from the description to the award. Biggest problem I see with most specs is they're overly written or they don't really cover what you need to cover. Keep it simple. You don't want to have the one like here, and I will read it to you real quickly. I apologize for the speed. It has been reported that there is a dangerous obstacle on the road ahead. In order to avoid this obstacle, please pay close attention to the sign. It will impart upon you the vital information which may, in preservation of life, the avoidance of almost certain death. The obstacle beyond is one which comes suddenly without proper warning. Is the intention to help you avoid this obstacle. We erect the sign. To avoid the obstacle, turn right. I've seen specs like that. If you want a cat, ask for a cat. If you want to tell people there's a turn ahead, say there's a turn ahead. Most specs are overly written. A good specification, remember, provides clear, easy to understand information to the bidder to guarantee the municipality gets what they want at a reasonable price. If you do a good job with a good spec, that actually happens. Now, I know all of you have to have a purchasing policy, so hopefully you do. So your purchasing policy says, when can I go buy things without any permission, direct purchases? When do I need to get quotes? When do I need to get written quotes? Though these days there's some rules about you might be able to do some written quotes orally, which is odd because oral quotes have to be in writing. What? Bids. When do you have to go out to bid? So does anybody have, in the Q&A pod, what is the limit where you have to at least go get a quote? In other words, what's the maximum you can spend without having to actually go and at least get a quote? Does anybody know what that is for your policy? $499, $1,000, $1,000, okay? Remember, set that number as low as you can so you don't lock your agency in, but you don't want to have it so high that there's no controls whatsoever. Oral quotes don't take that much, okay? Going around the state, the most common number I see for direct purchases is in the closer to 250 to 500 range, okay? The most common for oral quotes is up to about, I've seen as low as 1,000, up to about 5,000, though some go slightly higher. And then written quotes go all the way up to the state purchasing limit of $35,000 or $25,000, depending whether it's a public works activity or purchasing of an item. And of course, there's lots of exemptions: leases, purchasing from other municipalities, uh, get I think that last Saturday was the last major snowstorm we saw. Okay, I hope. Okay. Ooh, my internet connection is unstable. Oh boy. Hopefully we'll get through this. We're just going to briefly mention the customers and the stakeholders right now. We're not going to do a lot of public interactions. A lot of us are closed, but keep in mind, how do you deal with the public? A good way to think about that is, do you have complaint forms or service requests? And I don't care what's on the title. It's how we think about it. If all we think about when the public calls is, oh, here they come again, that's probably not going to give us good feedback with the public. On the other hand, if our attitude is, we're here to serve, it's amazing. The public knows it, and they treat us with respect. Okay? So finally, I'm going to finish with some departmental procedures I want you to keep in mind. Okay? Make sure your crews are trained. Make sure yourself is trained. And how do you train people? Well, books, videos, DVDs, online. We're posting as much material as we can on our information highway. Simulators are available, and we will get back to simulators. In fact, I suspect simulators may become very popular. Classroom training will come back, maybe a bit in a slightly different form, but there will be classroom. There's on-the-job training, which we're doing now. In-house, okay? And of course, tailgate talks, which you can get online and do with your crew, pretty simply, okay? Here's a rodeo that was done out in Allegheny County, and Mark Payne, who brought the simulators to the highway school many years and still is planning on doing so when we have highway school next year. The students who were helping Judge move the cones in on him, and he wondered why he kept hitting the cones when he was driving the course. But let's talk about SOPs to finish up. Standard operating procedures, what SOP stands for, and you should have them, but don't put more in writing than you need to. But a good standard operating procedure keeps us all safe and gets the job done efficiently and effectively. But make sure everybody knows what the SOP is. So for instance, I'm going to give you one that's a perfect example of the kind of thing you're thinking, I don't need to put this in writing. But in our building, they had a place to just get rid of the old stuff from making coffee. The problem was some of it was supposed to be composted, and they didn't have a sign. So all somebody did was put a sign that says, don't put the foil wrappers into the compost bin, and it made a difference. Keep it simple, okay? Make sure you've got good procedures and people follow them, okay? No. Here's a good example. Town policy, you wear a hard hat. Hard hat's only kept as long as they've got on the sticker on the hat or the little place where they've manufactured it. And hat did its job. It saved a person from at least a severe injury, if not more, fatality when a tree snapped. Versus these, I hate to say it, engineers in Oregon who have a hard hat policy for the DOT. And we're saying, well, if a rock falls, it'll kill me. Those big rocks, there were pebbles coming down from about 150 feet. If it didn't kill you, it certainly would hurt. That's why you wear a hard hat. Have good SOPs, write them down. And there's some examples in our manual if you're interested. Now, in terms of emergencies, are y'all all ready for emergencies? Okay, let's be honest. I want you to raise your hand if you were ready for this emergency. No? Nobody's going to raise their hand? Okay. That's the challenge with running a highway department. There's a lot going on. Okay. Y'all are all really good, smarter than I am. Okay. But we need to know where we're headed so we can move into the future. Okay. And it's always those things that come back to bite us that we weren't aware of, that we have to be ready for. So keep that in mind as you're running your department. What's the next thing that's under the ice? With that, I've got a couple of minutes. If you have a question, you throw it in the question and answer pod. I'll answer it for you. Otherwise, here's our sessions for the next week. We have a legal panel tomorrow. Please put your questions in, and you do have to register for these things, other than the bumper banter. to CLRP at Cornell.edu. We have a session on Thursday on soil and your roads and streets, getting good gravel, things like that. I'll give you a welcome update, hopefully some news about opening up the state from Bumper Banter on Monday. And then next week, as I said, common pavement maintenance techniques on Tuesday. And then on Thursday will be the session on asset management. So if there are any questions, otherwise, I will give you back a minute of your day. You have yourself a great afternoon. It looks like it's clouds are coming in, so get out there and get out there for a few minutes if you haven't already for the day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.